Now this is one of the best rogue flurry builds for dungeon farming and leveling. You'll speed through the dungeons and eliminate every enemy in your path. This build is a lot easier to use compared to other builds, and you don't really need any legendary aspects to utilize this build when leveling. I recommend to try this build out, especially in the beginning where respecting is really cheap, and you'll see how strong and easy it is to use this build and destroy your enemies. So let's check this out. Okay, so I'm going to show clearing this dungeon, and you'll see that I'm speeding through this dungeon and destroying everything in my path. I will complete dungeons within 5 to 8 minutes depending on the dungeon layout, and I can easily stagger bosses and destroy them. This build is really strong for dungeon farming and leveling all the way up to level 100. So starting with the skills, the basic skill will be puncture. The core skill of course will be flurry, and then we have the 3 imbuement skills. So shadow imbuement, cold imbuement, and poison imbuement. And our movement skill will be dash, but depending on the dungeon and what enemies you're fighting, you may want to switch dash to shadow step if you're fighting a lot of enemies with crowd control. But majority of the time, dash will be a lot better to use for speeding through the dungeons. And for the specializations, we're going to go ahead and use combo points, and this will greatly increase our damage. Okay, so next let's check out the skill tree. So for the basic skill, I put 1 point into puncture, 1 point into enhanced puncture, and 1 point into fundamental puncture. And this skill will provide energy and make enemies vulnerable. Next for the core skills, I put 5 points into flurry, 1 point into enhanced flurry, and 1 point into improved flurry. And of course, this is our main damaging skill. And the good thing about improved flurry is once you hit an enemy that's vulnerable, it will spread the vulnerable to all the other enemies around. Next, I put 3 points into sturdy and 3 points into siphoning strikes. And these 2 skills are really good for survivability. And I put 3 points into starter step. And of course, when it comes to dungeon farming and leveling, you're trying to maximize your movement speed as much as you can so you can explore the dungeon the quickest. Next for the agility skills, I put 1 point into dash, 1 point into enhanced dash, and 1 point into methodical dash. Now this is one of the fastest movement skills, but the thing about this skill, it doesn't have any CC protection. So for any dungeons that have really high crowd control, I recommend switching out the dash and put 1 point into shadow step, a point into enhanced shadow step, and a point into methodical shadow step. But for any other content, dash will be better because it doesn't require any enemies to use the skill compared to shadow step where you need to click on an enemy to use it. Next, I put 1 point into rugged and 3 points into reactive defense. The one big downside for this build is there's no real CC protection. So if we're CC'd, we need as much damage reduction as possible. And then I put 3 points into weapon mastery for the increased damage. Next for the subterfuge skills, I put 3 points into exploit and 3 points into malice. And of course, these skills are just for increased damage. So next for the imbuement skills. Now of course, we're going to take all 3 imbuement skills because once we activate our imbuement skills, we will drastically increase our damage. So I put 1 point into shadow imbuement, a point into enhanced shadow imbuement, and a point into mixed shadow imbuement. I put 1 point into poison imbuement, a point into enhanced poison imbuement, and a point into blended poison imbuement. I put 1 point into cold imbuement, a point into enhanced cold imbuement, and a point into mixed cold imbuement. I put 3 points into frigid finesse because the idea is when you fight an elite, try to use your cold imbuement skill because you'll freeze the elite and you'll do 30% increased bonus damage to them. And I put 3 points into precision imbuement. Now I do want to mention that cold imbuement chills enemies for 25%, and since flurry hits 4 times per cast, it's going to be 25% times 4, so it's 100% chill, which will instantly freeze any enemies. Next for the ultimate skills, I put 3 points into innervation for a chance to gain energy, 1 point into adrenaline rush, and 3 points into haste. And last but not least, for the key passive, I put 1 point into momentum, and this will greatly increase our damage reduction, our energy regeneration, and our movement speed. And with the skills and gear we're wearing, it is very easy to get 3 stacks of momentum. Okay, so next let's check out the gear. Now I do want to mention that if you're just leveling, just look for the plus green number until you reach ancestral level gear. Once you reach ancestral level gear, that's ideally when you want to be picky on what stats you want on your pieces of gear. And for the gear, I'm just going to point out the important stats you want and the legendary aspect, but I'll have the build planner in the description with the specific stats you want for each piece of gear. So starting with the helmet, the ideal stat you're looking for is cooldown reduction. And the legendary aspect I have is dealing direct damage to a vulnerable enemy has up to a 39% chance to daze them for 2 seconds. Now for the chest piece, you're looking for damage reduction, and the legendary aspect I have is basic skills grant 20% damage reduction for 6 seconds. Now for the gloves, you're looking for ranks of flurry, critical strike chance, and attack speed. And for the legendary aspect I have, you automatically drop a smoke grenade at the end of a dash. Dash's cooldown is reduced by 0.35 seconds for each enemy dazed this way, up to 1.5 seconds. And for the pants, you want damage reduction stats, and imbuement skill cooldown reduction is good as well. And for the legendary aspect I have, you gain 0.5% increased armor for 4 seconds when you deal any form of damage, stacking up to 30%. Now for the boots, what you're looking for is movement speed, and the legendary aspect is becoming injured while crowd control grants you unstoppable for 4 seconds. This effect has a 24-second cooldown. Now this aspect will be important once you reach near endgame. The reason why is this build doesn't have any crowd control breaks, unless you switch out your dash for the shadow step, but majority of the time you will use dash. So this is basically your only CC protection, and this legendary aspect did save my life multiple times. Now for the bow weapon slot, you're looking for a crossbow. The reason why it has vulnerable damage for its base stat, and the other stat you're looking for is vulnerable damage, critical strike damage, and critical strike damage with imbued skills. And the legendary aspect is your imbuement skills effect have 80% increased potency against vulnerable enemies. Now for the amulet, you're looking for movement speed and cooldown reduction. And for the legendary aspect, I have flurry damages enemies in a circle around you and deals 23% increased damage. Now for the rings, you're looking for vulnerable damage, critical strike chance, critical strike damage, and critical strike damage with imbued skills. And I have the same stats for both these rings, as you can see. Now the first ring legendary aspect is skills deal up to 15% increased damage based on your available primary resource when cast, receiving the maximum benefit while you have full primary resource. And for the second ring legendary aspect, I have basic skills gain 15% attack speed. Now for the sword and dagger, ideally what you're looking for is a sword, because the sword base stat has critical strike damage, and the stat you're looking for is vulnerable damage, critical strike damage, and critical strike damage with imbued skills. And the legendary aspect I have is attacking enemies with a basic skill increases the damage of your next core skill by 5% up to 30%. Now for the next weapon slot, I have a unique dagger, the Condemnation. Now if you can't find this unique dagger, try to find another weapon like this weapon. And the reason this unique dagger is good is because of the unique aspect, which states your core skills deal 38% increased damage when spending 3 combo points. Your basic skills when using this weapon have a 30% chance to generate 3 combo points. And for the gems, I'm using Topaz for the armor slot to get damage reduction while controlled impaired. For the accessories, I'm using Skulls for the armor. And for the weapons, I'm using the Emerald Gem for increased critical strike damage to vulnerable enemies. Alright, so that's pretty much the gear you're looking for this build. Now, I do want to mention that with this build, you technically don't need any legendary aspect when leveling, because all your skills are really strong initially. Now, if you do want a significant boost right from the start, you can do the Forsaken Quarry dungeon, and this dungeon is right at the starting point. So you can go to this dungeon right away. As you can see, Kayaba Shad is right here, and the dungeon you're looking for is right here. And of course, this dungeon gives you the legendary aspect. Flurry damages enemies in a circle around you and deals increased damage. But like I mentioned, this legendary aspect is not really needed when leveling, because your skills are initially just really strong. But since this dungeon is right in the beginning of the starting zone, you might as well just pick this up really quick. And you may think that damaging enemies in a circle will increase your dungeon clear time because of the AoE, but even without this legendary aspect, the skill Flurry has good range in front of you, so you should easily destroy a group of enemies without using this legendary aspect. Okay, so next I'm going to quickly go over the Paragon Board, but I'll have the full build guide in the description below. So for the starting Paragon Board, the glyph socket I chose was Control, for the increased crowd control damage when we freeze the enemies with the cold imbuement skill. And then we went up this path. And for the second Paragon Board, I went with Eldritch Bounty. Then I went this way. And for the glyph socket, I have Combat for critical strike damage. And of course, we're going to take the legendary node, the Eldritch Bounty, because when you attack with imbued skill, you gain 20% resistance and 20% increased damage for that imbuement element for 9 seconds. For the next Paragon Board, we went Exploit Weakness, and then I went down this way. And for the glyph socket, I went Infusion for the increased imbued skill damage. And we did take the legendary node Exploit Weakness, which states whenever you deal damage to a vulnerable enemy, they take 1% increased damage from you for 6 seconds up to 15%. Then we went ahead and went down this way. And for the next Paragon Board, we went with Tricks of the Trade, and then we went down this path. And for the glyph socket, I have Closer, which increases our Cutthroat skill damage. And we took the legendary node Tricks of the Trade, which states your marksman skills grant you the next Cutthroat skill 25% increased damage, and your Cutthroat skills grant your next marksman skill 25% increased damage. Now, since we're using a marksman skill and a Cutthroat skill, this will greatly increase our damage. And for the last Paragon Board, I went with No Witness. I went ahead and went this path. And for this glyph socket, I have Exploit for the increased vulnerable damage. An additional bonus is also great, because when an enemy is damaged by you, they become vulnerable for 3 seconds. Okay, so that's pretty much the full Paragon Board at level 100. Now, I do want to mention that when you're leveling your Paragon Board, you do want to use some of the glyph sockets sooner than later, like the glyph socket Exploit. This Paragon Board is just optimized at level 100 and maximizing the bonus stats. And make sure you look at your stats on the side and try to get the bonus stats on the rare nodes. Alright, so thanks for checking out one of the best rogue flurry builds for dungeon farming and leveling. Now just be aware that this build is not meant for the highest tiered nightmare dungeons or fighting Uber Lilith, but you should be able to easily speed farm for the gear you're looking for when using this build. Hope this helps and more Diablo 4 videos to come, so stay tuned. And of course,